Meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren, liebe Freunde der Connections-Reihe, im Namen der 4 Museen in der Pinakothek der Moderne heiße ich Sie herzlich willkommen hier im Ernst von Siemens-Auditorium. Die Connections-Reihe wird auch in diesem Jahr von EY unterstützt und ich möchte unserem Förderer dafür danken, dass er uns dieses Veranstaltungsformat ermöglicht, auch weiterhin. Seit 14 Tagen zeigen wir in der Pinakothek der Moderne die erste posthume Museumsretrospektive auf das Werk von Raoul De Keyser. Den Wunsch zu dieser Ausstellung gibt es schon lange, denn Raoul De Keyser gehört zu den Künstlern, die das unendliche Potenzial kennen, das die Malerei bietet und auch immer weiter in Zukunft bieten wird. Raoul De Keyser ist ein Künstler, der es auf besondere Weise versteht, mit Bildern zu spielen. Ein Blick in das Studio, in sein Studio, ungefähr 2009, also 3 Jahre vor seinem Tod aufgenommen, kann eine Idee davon vermitteln. Denn dort sieht man, dass ein Bild für Raoul De Keyser nichts Abgeschlossenes war. Vielmehr stand jedes einzelne Bild für ihn in Verbindung mit bereits gesehenen, bereits geschaffenen Bildern und hatte auch Einfluss auf später entstehende. Und so ist auch diese Hängung, wie wir sie auch in der Ausstellung in einem Raum versucht haben zu imitieren, im Grunde auch ein Resultat dieses Erzählens mit Bildern und vielleicht auch der Vorstellung, dass die Bilder alle eine Familie bilden. Und auch Raoul De Keyser hat von seinen Werken wie von seinen Kindern gesprochen. Der Gedanke, dass jedes Bild mit einem anderen zusammenhängt, dass jedes Werk als Bestandteil eines verzweigten visuellen Netzwerks zu betrachten ist, dem liegt auch unsere Ausstellung, also beziehungsweise das Konzept unserer Ausstellung zugrunde. Ihr Titel ist Œuvre, das Wort in allen Sprachen, die in Belgien gesprochen werden, zu verstehen. Das Wort, das ein Einzelbild meint, aber in dem sich auch das Gesamtschaffen spiegelt. Raoul De Keyser ist damit ein sehr junger Künstler, auch wenn er nächstes Jahr 90 Jahre alt geworden wäre. Denn er hat unser Zeitalter der Bilder auf seine Weise vorausgesehen. Zu gerne hätten wir Raoul De Keyser selbst zu seinem Schaffen befragt, doch leider ist er in 2012 verstorben. Da ist es ein Glücksfall, dass einer der besten Kenner des Werks von Raoul De Keyser unserer Einladung nach München gefolgt ist und sich bereit erklärt hat, und etwas mehr über die Arbeitsweise dieses Künstlers zu erzählen, vor allen Dingen einen ganz bestimmten Aspekt. Herzlich willkommen in der Pinakothek der Moderne, Steven Jacobs. Steven Jacobs ist Kunsthistoriker und spezialisiert auf die Beziehung zwischen bildender Kunst und Film. Andere Forschungsinteressen richten sich auf die visuelle Darstellung von Architektur, Städtebau und Landschaft in Film und Fotografie. Weiterhin hat er sich mit verschiedenen Themen der belgischen Kunst der Moderne auseinandergesetzt, etwa mit Henry van de Velde oder Dirk Brackmann, aber auch viel und intensiv mit Raoul De Keyser. Steven Jacobs hat zahlreiche Ausstellungen und Filmprogramme kuratiert, unter anderem für das SMAC in Gent, das Martha Herford oder das Museum für moderne Kunst in Arnheim. Daneben publizierte er und publiziert in unterschiedlichen Zeitschriften, darunter in Art Journal, October, History of Photography, The Journal of Architecture oder im Millennium Film Journal. Er hat, wie ich finde, interessante Bücher geschrieben, zumindest versprechen, dass die Titel, ich habe sie nicht gelesen, ich habe aber mich inspirieren lassen von diesen Titeln, also außer den Raoul De Keyser Büchern natürlich, zum Beispiel über die Architektur bei Alfred Hitchcock, die Skulptur und das Kino oder Gemälde im Film Noir, also immer diese Übergangsthemen. Und er hat Schaffenskomplexe von Raoul De Keyser in Werkverzeichnissen dokumentiert. Im Katalog zu unserer Ausstellung, den ich allen nochmal empfehlen möchte, der wunderbar geworden ist, wunderschön, hat Steven Jacobs zusammen mit Hilde Dyer die Chronologie von Raoul De Keyser, also das Leben, die Biografie und die Einflüsse zusammengestellt. Das hat es vorher nicht gegeben und ist dabei auch auf ganz interessante Erkenntnisse gestoßen. An der Universität von Gent lehrt Steven Jacobs moderne und zeitgenössische Kunst und an der Universität von Antwerpen unterrichtet er Filmgeschichte. Ich glaube, wir haben Gründe genug, Steven Jacobs jetzt auf die Bühne zu bitten und ich wünsche uns allen einen interessanten Abend.
Thank you. Thank you, Bernhart, and also the staff members of the Pinakothek der Moderne for inviting me here in this wonderful museum. And first of all, my apologies for giving this talk in English instead of German, despite the fact that Raoul de Keyser has such a close connection to the German-speaking world with very important exhibitions in Bern, in Bonn, and many other German cities. So the topic of my talk is also the topic of my essay in the catalog, and it deals with the relation between Raoul de Keyser and photography. As probably many of you will know, the interaction between painting and photography is very important throughout the 20th century and also in contemporary art. If you think about major important artists and especially painters, their work, you could say, is even inconceivable without photography. And at first sight, these topics seem not really relevant for the paintings of Raoul de Keyser. In de Keyser's paintings, you cannot find these kind of photorealist effects that you can see in the works by Gerhard Richter or Luc Tuymans. There is no attempt to, for instance, imitate the grain of the photograph or the grids of photographic reproductions, which you can see, for instance, in the works by Polke. There is no suggestion, or in most works, of course, there's no suggestion of a kind of photographic gloss, which was an interesting topic for many painters. There's no simulation of motion blur. There are no attempts to imitate or evoke a kind of reflection of light, which many painters try to do. Or there's no attempt to reflect on the interaction between positive and negative image, which you can find, for instance, in the paintings by Andy Warhol. All these things, at first sight, they seem completely irrelevant for the paintings of Raoul de Keyser. And also, on a more general level, this kind of idea that we live in a world which is saturated by images, by mechanical or digital images provided by the mass media, which was also a topic which became very important from the late 70s and early 80s onwards, for instance. That is not really a topic that Raoul de Keyser dealt with explicitly in most of his paintings. Nonetheless, it's this kind of context which is important for him. I mean, Raoul de Keyser, although he started his career in the early 60s, of course he became only world famous, you could say, from the late 80s onwards. His breakthrough in the international art world you could situate between 86 and 92, for instance. That was exactly the time when there was lots of discussion on this kind of the idea of the simulacrum and the idea that the confrontation with the world is per definition marked by this kind of idea that the world is saturated by images, by image technologies and things like that. On the contrary, Raoul de Keyser seems at first sight like a kind of craftsman who was merely preoccupied with the paint, with the material of the paint, with the material of the stretcher, things like that. Things and topics which have been emphasized by many art critics, and also I myself have written texts on de Keyser emphasizing these things. And that's Raoul de Keyser already from the late 70s and early 80s was called a painter's painter. A painter, he's not only a painter dealing with the materiality of paint, but also a painter emphasizing the specificities of the craft of painting. A painter who was also very much liked by other painters and even celebrated by many other painters. Nonetheless, and especially research in the personal archives of Raoul De Keyser demonstrates, recent research demonstrates that photography did play an important part in Raoul De Keyser's work. And so his personal archives are now at Gent University, in the Central Library of Gent University. You can browse or surf to the website and see what's more or less on there. And in the archive, of course, as in practically all personal archives by artists, you can find many photographs. And of course, you can find like photographic portraits, many reproductions of his paintings, studio and installation views and so forth. But there's more. Many materials also demonstrate that photography was indeed important for De Keyser's artistic process, for the creation process, for the process of creation of his paintings. Also a topic which was completely forgotten, and I mean there were no visible traces of that, is that De Keyser himself was a talented amateur photographer. We know, for instance, that already in the early 60s he also installed a darkroom in his new house, and that he played with photography that on a kind of amateur level, and that photography was an important part of his daily existence and his day-to-day professions. And many of his photographs were linked to his activities as an art journalist and particularly a sports journalist. And so De Keyser, he was first and foremost, he only became like a professional artist around 63, 64, 65. He was a civil servant professionally, and only in the 70s he became like a full-time, or even for a long time only a part-time professional painter. But he kept on doing art journalism and particularly sports journalism up to the late 60s, early 70s. And here you can see his press card for the socialist newspaper Vooruit in the mid-50s. And so in the context of this, these activities, he of course took many photographs, and these are some prints you can find in the personal archives of particularly bikers or bike racers and football players, photographs that he took himself. And of course this will be motifs, or these will turn into motifs that also will reappear or pop up in his paintings of the mid-60s up until the late 60s. But what was completely forgotten, and which was really a big discovery when we browsed his archives and looked for more, is that De Keyser also in the early 60s took photographs which you could say had more artistic ambitions, you could say. There's like a lot of photographs of still lifes, such as here of a fruit bowl with a very strange combination, not only with fruit, a ballpoint, but also like a box of a medicine. There is a wooden table with empty coffee cups in a row, and with the very funny, the sugar cups in cubes in front of them. If you count them, you can see 12 of them, so maybe it's a soccer team with the coach drinking coffee, you could say. Also, there is a sports bag in a cloakroom, and so these kind of photographs, you can find many more in the personal archives of De Keyser. So strikingly, these kinds of pictures, they are perfectly in line with the earliest paintings, and dating from exactly the same periods. And so they evoke everyday situations. Here, part of the living room, a corner of the garden, for instance. And so they all, in a way, are evoking human activities in an environment created by humans without human beings being present. That's a kind of idea you can see in the photographs, but also in many of his earliest paintings. With earliest paintings, I also have to make a little side note here. Raoul De Keyser, born in 1930, already started to paint in the late 40s, and he even had public exhibitions in 48, 49, but he was dissatisfied with his works. He destroyed many of his earliest works, stopped painting completely, and it's only so in 63, 64 when he restarted painting and making like a kind of new start. And so it's exactly in those years that these photographs are dated. Another Raoul De Keyser photograph, and it's an empty sidewalk of a cafe in the south of France, in Saint-Maxime. And on the rear of that photograph, there is like a title. It's called Siesta. And also on the rear of the photograph, in pencil, there was written Zondagsvriend, friend of the Sunday. And then I start looking, and Zondagsvriend is actually a weekly. It's a weekly from Antwerp. And so I start looking, and I browsed all the years, 62, all the issues of 62, 63, 64, and I found this. It's a kind of photography competition, and don't laugh, and it's really serious. He won the 13th prize in the category of starters with in this kind of photo composition. And I quote the critic writing about these photos. They're technically flawless and very beautiful as a recording itself, yet there is something missing in this image. Is it a matter of more light? The presence of a human being? I couldn't tell. And so, strikingly, Raoul De Keyser was an amateur photographer, but he also presented his photographs in public and dated 63. So exactly at the same time he also started painting. This is really interesting. So that's why I really wanted to know more about it and delved into it and looked for more clues. The text also refers to another image, which is not reproduced, but and it's called a photograph entitled Market Life with Holiday Eyes. And so it's probably this one, Marktleven met vakantieogen, Market Life with Holiday Eyes, which the critics, or that critic wrote about it. It's also nicely photographed, full of humor and spontaneity. As you can see, many of these photographs, and they are familiar with, or they evoke this entire very important tradition of what is usually called street photography, which was of course highly popular from the 1930s to the 1960s, a kind of model of photography which was marked by humanist ideals in which the photographer focused on the small contingencies of everyday life. And the idea was that the photographer should demonstrate his skills by combining something spontaneous, like capturing the spontaneously a concrete detail of everyday life, but at the same time it was important to transcend this kind of anecdotal dimension and to make a statement about the human condition in general. And this was the really kind of masterful photography by photographers such as Kertész and Cartier-Bresson, which was very popular in the 40s and 50s. And I remember Raoul De Keyser really telling me about his fascination for these photographers, but at the time I never made a link with his own experiments as an amateur photographer, simply because I didn't know that he was active as a photographer in those years. So these kinds of combination also, I remember Raoul De Keyser telling me that he was fond of that book, particularly in the way the curves, the gentle curves, the elegant curves that you can find in every photograph of Cartier-Bresson, that it was combined with the gentle curves of Matisse, for instance, in that book, Images à la Sauvette. And to a certain extent, you can find the same combination in one of the most beautiful books I think ever made on Raoul's work. It's the catalog from an exhibition rondom de werkelijkheid, around reality, surrounding reality, which was the catalog of a show in Groningen in the north of Holland in 1970. And also there you have this kind of combination between the very graphic black and white photographs made by a local photographer, John Stoel, and the colorful, curvy shapes in the paintings by De Keyser, and the poppy colors De Keyser was working at the time. So, strikingly, De Keyser's experiments with arts photography, they occurred precisely at the time when he started painting again, after years of inactivity as a painter. So, and also strikingly, this restart, you could say, of his artistic career, 63, 64, 65, is of course also a moment when an entire generation of artists is attracted to photography, because it's a popular medium, it's a democratic medium, it's an inexpensive medium, and as we already saw, many artists working or coming to the fore in the mid-1960s, they often refer to photography, to photographs, to specific elements of the photographic language in many of their paintings. And of course, it's also in that decade that many visual artists and painters themselves started making photographs, using photography themselves, often using amateur equipment, using Polaroids, using instamatic photographs and things like that. And they favored photography because of its simplicity, its neutrality, its so-called industrial character, but also because photography made a new connection with the everyday world possible. After the 1950s, when most of the artists were rather interested in turning their backs toward the visible everyday reality and looking more into kind of mystical or inward or subjective world, which was very important in for the previous generation, abstract expressionism, lyrical abstraction, and so forth. So in this kind of photographic gaze, you could say, this gaze you can find in many works of De Keyser, although less explicit maybe than in the works by the painters we all know. In many paintings, for instance, in the early paintings by De Keyser, I mean early again in the sense of the New Start, many framings, for instance, are inspired, you could say, by the artistic edges, the arbitrary edges, the arbitrary borders of snapshots. Another topic which was important in the earliest works by De Keyser is the use of close-ups. One work even has explicitly the title Blow Up. And so many of these paintings, they present themselves as close-ups. And even if you look into the relation between several paintings, those three paintings brought together here, I think for the first time since, or I mean again, since a long time, here also upstairs, the first three paintings on your left, if you enter the rooms of the exhibition, and they were also together at the SMAC venue in Gent. But between these works, there is to a certain extent a kind of photographic operation, you could say. One painting looks like a close-up of another, and still another one looks like a close-up of the other one. And so this kind of fascination for close-ups was of course very important in the days. Also pop artists, they worked with close-up like compositions, and like in a way the pop artists, also De Keyser played on the surprising effects, the defamiliarizing effects of photographic close-ups. And so the close-up, of course, has been a very important device in modernist photography, modernist cinema, and modernist art in general, and very closely connected to this idea of a close-up was a kind of revelatory dimension of the close-up, almost like a kind of mystical dimension of the close-up, and it was emphasized in many film and photo theoretical texts, for instance, in the 1920s, and by authors such as Walter Benjamin or Béla Balázs or Jean Epstein. And this was the close-up as something which reveals a kind of higher dimension between the mere surfaces. But of course, this dimension was completely absent for the artists of the 1960s. Rather than revealing something else, the close-up was a means to simplify the image, to abstract the image, to make it more readable, you could say, rather than bringing us closer to the things. The close-up enables us to create a distance vis-à-vis the objects on the screen or the objects on the paintings. Already in the 1960s, and that's also a thing I never noticed before, but when I really started looking into the, of course, mostly local, mostly Flemish art critics who wrote on De Keyser in the first years when he restarted his artistic career, but many of them noticed the so-called photographic sensitivity in De Keyser's paintings. The optics of De Keyser is largely indebted to photography, one critic wrote. Another one spoke about a preference for photographic perspectives and photographic croppings. And a third one, Roland Joris, who was an important poet and an important art critic and a very good friend of Raoul De Keyser, he wrote about De Keyser that or about his works, that he's playing with depth, perspective and reality that was enhanced by a flirtation with photography. And he also said that De Keyser looked at reality as if through the lens of a camera. And he also said that between the artist, between the painter and the reality, there is like a kind of technoid object, that is the camera. So in short, early critics, they discovered this kind of photographic gaze on reality. And they said that De Keyser was inspired by formal practices, you could say, that deal or are related to photography and the use of certain perspectives, the use of the close-up, the use of croppings, for instance, but also, importantly, that photography contributes to a certain attitude vis-à-vis reality. And there's desire for objectivity and the importance of something in between the artist and reality, and this kind of technoid object of a camera. You don't look at reality directly, you look through a kind of other medium at reality also as a painter. And so in several of the earliest paintings by De Keyser, you can find certain evocations of photographic effects. In Racer, for instance, which is also painting included here in the show, but this is a cropped image of a larger painting, which is of course destroyed. You can see it there on the right image on the left, representing a car racer explicitly. And so these paintings, they evoke like a kind of speed, also they evoke in a way a kind of motion blur, reminiscent of the aesthetics of snapshots, of course. Also, Anoniem is also no doubt a cutout of a bigger painting, also evoking a kind of motion of light, for instance. Or in other paintings you have this kind of perspectival distortions that evoke the distortions of certain photographic lenses. Still other examples, very remarkable a painting, a very exceptional painting, Zonder, Albert, referring to the owner of the work for many years. So here you have, it's one of the very rare paintings where you have human figures in the Keyser paintings, but you can see it immediately. There's like a very strange color effect, and of course it's reminiscent of photo negatives. It's based maybe on a photograph of one of his sons playing with blocks there, but rather than based on the photograph, you could say it's rather based on the negative image of the photograph. And so the dark is light and light is dark, and the grayscales in that image have been reversed. In other works, the photographic gaze on the world, or the medium of photography, has been made explicit in titles of works, for instance. With Minolta to Laarne. Laarne is a little place in the outskirts of Ghent where there is a beautiful castle. So it was. It's a work that disappeared. It's this one, of course, and so also with a silhouette of a human figure. Of course, I reversed this image, and this is a negative. But below the image, you have these kind of numbers in a kind of strip that is, of course, reminiscent of photographic film. These are installation views of an exhibition in Lokeren, a small town in Flanders in '66. Actually, an exhibition curated by Roland Joris, the poet I quoted just a minute ago. Another one here, another destroyed or lost work from '65. It's the artist, his own wife, in bed after childbirth. And also this one is clearly based on a photograph of which a negative survives in the archive. And strikingly is that you have this kind of composition, but here on the right side of the image, there's a repetition of the same image in a kind of reduced format. And of course, there are small variations. And also these, of course, they evoke negatives or contact prints of a photograph. It's another painting which, I mean, a detail, a fragment still survives, but that was the original painting, a very strange, it was a diptych, as you can see. And here again, and this kind of strip, een dagje in de open lucht, a day in plein air, a day in nature, as it were. So it's a work of from 66, but later transformed, again with these kind of negative or photo strips on the sides. That's another one, lost painting, which bears a certain similarity with that Albert and Zonder painting, where you have this kind of silhouette-like shape. Also this kind of repetition, like a kind of photographic procedure. But here it seems as if there's a baby or a kid that has been photographed in different light conditions, you could say. And the same color image, but taken in changing light condition, maybe. So such works, of course, they are clearly inspired by photographs, but they also include photographic imagery in the composition. It becomes a subject, it becomes a topic, it becomes a motif in these paintings. Another one, which I'm happy to show, it's not in the catalog or in my essay in the catalog, because only recently we discovered this. We have been looking at for this work for decades, but only recently it popped up. So lichtmeter, light meter, with an explicit reference to the skill, the profession of photography, and probably here this kind of silhouette of a light meter. So there are lots of works in the mid-60s with explicit references to photography. And as you already saw, many works are inspired or are directly based on specific photographs. And of course, there are many more. Also, many of the quite known works by de Keyser. And also for me, that was a big surprise when I started browsing through his personal archives. There are hundreds of snapshots of windows, of corners of the house, of door handles, of barbed wire, football stockings. And so it seems that these photographs were quite important for the Keyser, not only for selecting a kind of motif, but also selecting a viewpoint on the motif. The placement of the object in the framing, and the testing of the composition. It sometimes really reappears in paintings. So, and I could show, I mean, really dozens of such examples. I just show you a few. The car of the family that appears in paintings of the mid-60s, and a bike. Ruggelings, so it's 65, 66. He actually made quite a lot of paintings with human figures that would disappear completely later onwards. Yeah, also usually mostly abstract forms, abstract human forms like silhouettes or a Rückenfigur, such as in this case. But also barbed wire, and they're lovely snapshots of these motifs. The domestic environment in the living room, or the house he built where he started to live in from 1960 onwards, and that was his studio dwelling up until he died in 2012. So all these motifs and these snapshots, and they illustrate the Keyser interest in everyday surroundings. And it's quite important, I think, to see these kind of paintings. They relate to an everyday environment that is in full development, that is completely changing in the 60s, in the early 70s, certainly as a result of the suburbanization, which was very important in Flanders in the 60s and 70s, with new quarters developed outside the main cities. And it was quite an important topic for several other Flemish artists in the 60s and 70s, like Roger Ravel, but probably unknown outside Belgium, and the hyper-realist painter Antoine de Klerk, who was also a close friend of Raoul de Keyser, and a hyper-realist painter, of course, who also used this kind of photographic gaze. So, and it's a kind of environment, it's a kind of landscape, a traditional rural landscape, but a rural landscape that is marked by the paraphernalia of modern urbanity, and new ways, new roads, traffic lights, and things like that. So also in Belgian pop art, for instance, and in most European pop art, I think, you never find like this kind of spectacular kaleidoscopic imagery of the American modern metropolis, and the huge billboards and things like that. It's much more moderate language. And so also many photographs you can find in the Keyser archives are related to this kind of landscape. A photograph of a concrete pole at the side of the road, that of course is also an abstract play of forms, of parallel strips that you can see in many paintings of the 60s. And these forms resonate with the similar patterns in many paintings, such as Field, or the Signal paintings, of which he made several variations. And of course also the famous slices, and the paintings becoming three-dimensional objects the Keyser made also in the mid-60s. Also an important topic in the Keyser's activities as an amateur photographer are many photographs of details of the house. And also here you see this kind of play on vertical shapes. And it's also actually, I mean, I can't show or I can't demonstrate these kind of very literal connections between photograph and painterly compositions, but in a way they reappear in many paintings, certainly in the so-called more architectural paintings of the 1980s and late 80s, early 90s, such as these ones, or also in some paintings shortly after 2000. He also made more like paintings consisting of architectural shapes, and lots of them have these kinds of organization or compositional structure that are very close to these kinds of photographs that show details of the house. So many paintings of de Keyser are clearly inspired by photographs of the everyday surroundings, the daily surroundings of his own life and the domestic world he lived in, the garden close to the house, and like this garden gate, excuse me, in which you have this very strange-like shape, but of course it relates to this fence here. So this is the kind of world I was talking about, a new world of bungalows, of garden plots, of newly constructed roads and highways, but also a landscape, I think, and this is very important for de Keyser, with recreation parks and sports facilities. And it's so this kind of new landscape which was the result of the economic boom of the 1960s, and also with an increasing availability of spare time, of hobbies and things like that. And spare time, the holidays, it's an important topic for de Keyser's career, I think, like themes of canoeing and camping, they relate to this kind of atmosphere. The tent, the camping tent, a very important recurring topic in the late 60s, early 70s, which is a typical de Keyser topic in many perspectives, in many ways, because in a way, of course, it relates to this kind of democratic, everyday surrounding, but also typical de Keyser in the sense that it's a perfect motif for a painter that is interested in painting. And this kind of self-reflexive element has always been important for de Keyser, but it's always in a very playful way, in a sense that the camping paintings, they are paintings of canvases. So they are like canvases on canvases. It's like a kind of a picture made in canvas of a canvas. And so there's this kind of play on different dimensions of reality. You can find it in many paintings by de Keyser. And that's why I think the motif of the tent has been very important. Also, the boxes he made, the three-dimensional boxes he made in the 60s, they are like tent-like constructions. They are canvases attached to like a kind of wooden frame, as tents are to a certain extent. And so this is, of course, no doubt a simple family snapshot, but also in the archives by de Keyser, you can find pictures like these. So this is clearly not a family photograph. You could say it's the painter's eye that is looking at, it's in his own garden, by the way, this tent. And so there's an entire series of tent paintings in the late 60s, early 70s, and it reappears in family photographs, but clearly these slides, and they have clearly, there's no doubt there is another agenda here. There are more almost abstract images, and they are clearly photographic studies for his paintings or drawings or silk screens. It's also the late 60s is also the period when de Keyser started experimenting with silk screens, and there are several silk screens also of the tent motif. So apart from the tent, sports is also a very important topic at that time, and I already referred to de Keyser's activities as a sports journalist. Many paintings referring to biking, bike racing, and of course also sports. It's a phenomenon closely connected to photography from the very start. And also the tent and the holiday, of course. It's the camping ground, it's a locus classicus of amateur photography. It's the family outings and the family holiday gatherings. They are typical photographic topics, photographic subjects, you could say. And so, as already said, in the archives, many photographs of football teams, or other side topics or subtopics referring to soccer, like the stockings. A couple of months ago, there was a booklet was made. Bernhart knows it already. The booklet was made on all the stockings that De Keyser painted in the late 60s and or up until the mid 70s. So also these are tested out with photographs. And of course, more familiar is the motif of the chalk line, which is of course also very important in the exhibition upstairs. And actually, when you enter the exhibition, you're immediately confronted, or even if you're on the completely other side of the museum, you see the chalk lines by Raoul De Keyser, a motif which has been important for the Keysers for decades. And also this, of course, answers to this modernist tradition of self-reflection. It's also like the tent paintings are canvases about canvases. These are paintings or drawings on the act of painting, on the act of putting a form into a field, on the act of putting a chalk line in on the grass. So they are like a kind of meditation on the act of painting. But also here, De Keyser uses photography not only to discover the topic, not only to discover the subject of the painting, but also looking for solutions for the compositions, for the placing of lines in relation to the frame, for selecting viewpoints, and so on. And so many photographs, you can link them directly to many of the paintings, the drawings, the print works of chalk lines that were particularly important in the 1970s, and the most minimalist, the most severe, the most ascetic period in De Keyser's career. And so I could show you many more, but you see reappear the same structure, the same form all over, and not only in paintings, but also in lino cuts, for instance, over here and here, and even on the posters of exhibitions. Also in his archives, all kinds of other details related to football fields, football goals, football nets, and so forth. And these, of course, relate to other projects. Maybe you're not familiar with this. De Keyser also, when my students found some of these photographs, we discovered another chalk line that Raoul De Keyser photographed. But actually, that's one of the few installations Raoul De Keyser did. He made it twice. So on the lawn of the entrance of the museum in Groningen, for instance, he drew a chalk line on the grass on the lawn. But this then, in turn, became the inspiration for a painting as well. A Kalkleinen Hoek chalk line corner, which is part of the collection of the Museum of Contemporary Art, SMAC, in Gent. And so this kind of motif became entangled, you could say, with Raoul De Keyser's persona. When press photographers made portraits of De Keyser, they often asked him to pose and to have him photographed in close connection to the motif of his paintings. Also, even when he appeared on television, they interviewed him on the pitch of the football field close to his house. And also, as you can see in the exhibition upstairs, on one of the ultimate works by De Keyser, this very small work, Robben 2, one of the last works by De Keyser. It's actually includes a literal photograph of course, Arjen Robben, and the football player lying with his head against this chalk line, and here there's like a kind of new line added by the artist. So even with this work, you can see that photography remained an important element, even in his later work for De Keyser, as an important aid, for instance, but also as a motif in many of his works of the 1990s and 1990s, and even works after 2000, you can see lots of relations with photographic studies, with photographic explorations. Like a topic that became very important in the 80s and early 90s is the monkey puzzle tree, which you can see in many of his paintings, but also there are dozens of photographs of the tree, which you can see if you visit the Keysers' house, his house and studio house. You can see it right through the window. And also the way the door and the window frames the tree is something that is important in those photographs, I think. And the way the picture of the tree is cropped by the tree. And on the other hand, another topic I think De Keyser was interested in is the tree as a kind of irregular grid that obstructs the view on the landscape and makes it rather two-dimensional, the image. And so also very fascinating. I don't know what to do with this image, but on many photographs, traces of all kinds of calculations of grids. I don't know, I didn't figure out what, I even asked a mathematician what it could be, calculating distances. I mean, but I mean, it just demonstrates how important these kinds of elements were in the process of artistic creation for De Keyser. Here's another one of those monkey puzzle tree pictures made by De Keyser in the 1990s. Also this picture, that beautiful picture, which is also included here in the exhibition upstairs, in which it's always, or almost something like there are partitions of the sky hanging in this tree. And then in the archive, I also found this. Maybe it's a little joke. It's not maybe a literal translation of this picture, but again, it demonstrates how De Keyser is interested in this kind of dialectic between painting and photography. Also in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, the domestic environment of the house becomes important again. And an important element, an important topic that was also actually important in the very first paintings of the mid-60s is the door handle, or the window handle. You can see it in many paintings of the 60s, and also in the Keyser archives snapshots. And they're also like, I'm only showing 3, there are lots of more. Snapshots like this, definitely taken much later, probably in the late 90s, not in the 60s. And of course the shape reappears in many paintings, also in some of these, which you can see here upstairs in the exhibition. An interesting topic, I think, the door handle or the window handle, because it's like a kind of sidestep from the motif of the window, which of course is such an important motif throughout the history of Western painting. And it's also, again, it tallies with Raoul De Keyser's interest in I mean, the status of the painting and the status of the representational image. As you all know, the painting or modern painting when it originated in the 15th century in the Italian Renaissance with Alberti's idea that the painting is no longer a flat surface we're looking at. The painting, in contrast, is a frame we are looking through it instead of looking at it. And this kind of idea, which then of course was overthrown by modernist painting, in the paintings by Cézanne, in the paintings by Picasso, in the paintings by Matisse, we are looking again at the flat surface instead of looking through a frame. And it's not a coincidence that so many modernist painters throughout the 20th century, from René Magritte to Robert Delaunay, Ellsworth Kelly, they painted many, many windows. And De Keyser also, so with his interest in chalk lines, his interest in tents, it tallies with these kinds of interest. But instead of painting windows, he paints window handles, for instance, or door handles. Something similar with blinds in the living room. Also, instead of giving us a vista to the reality, it obstructs the view. It's another link to the window, making the view impossible. And another something similar are the many sloppy snapshots of corners in the house, of rooms, of wooden cupboards, of wainscotings. And also this relates, of course, to the first paintings showing from the 60s, showing the domestic environment, but it can be linked also to the many more abstract architectural paintings of the late 80s, early 90s. And also this painting, entitled, you can see here upstairs. So these are details from Raoul De Keyser's living room, which was rebuilt. So De Keyser built his own house in the, he let his own house built in the early 60s, but the interior, the ground floor was refurbished, was rearranged in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s by Robrecht and Daam, and the architectural firm from Gent. And Robrecht, Daam and De Keyser, they worked together on many instances, also in the pavilions of Documenta in 1992, Documenta 9, in which the paintings were not by De Keyser and also Gerhard Richter, they were not exhibited in the Fridericianum, but instead they were exhibited in the pavilion by Robrecht Daam in the garden in the Ouwepark. And so this is a detail from that interior by Robrecht Daam. Here's another one. And as you can see, in the living room, the walls were equipped with like a kind of wainscoting with a wooden paneling. And there is like a little ledge which De Keyser used to put paintings on. And when you visited De Keyser, he was always changing one painting to the other and shifting them and manipulating them, not only in his studio upstairs, but also in his living room. And this kind of image reappeared in the poster and the leaflet of the Bern exhibition in 91. So, as you can see, many of these photographs were used as a source of inspiration. And De Keyser used photographies to select a motif, to test the framing, to test the composition, to test a viewpoint. But concluding my talk, I also would like to show some other examples. Some photographs by Raoul De Keyser, they clearly had another role than simply being a source of inspiration, you could say. Many photographs, they were also used as an instrument in the process of creation. And here comes, some other details of that interior first. I also found these, but I could not relate them to any painting so far, but lots of them. So here. Many paintings, for instance, many photographs taken by Raoul De Keyser, they show his own work. And I think many of these pictures reflect on the spatial impact of his paintings. The way several viewpoints of different viewpoints create different effects of paintings. And again, this relates to the way De Keyser himself manipulated, touched his paintings. He manipulated them, shifted them, tilted them. He spread them out on the floor, tried different configurations on the wall. And in the early days, in the 60s, he often used the garden, a garden-like environment, where you can see a painting, like also here one of the earliest paintings of the new De Keyser from the 60s, also here on display upstairs. Baron, the dog of the family, in an all-held an all-held field, of course referring to the American abstract painter Al-Held, who had a major exhibition in Eindhoven, in the south of Holland, and in that year, in 66, so it's the double date, and you can see clearly the two styles here in the painting, the typical more loosely painted dog, which was painted in the style of his paintings of 64, and then the more flattened, two-dimensional, large surfaces of Al Held's canvases, and also the colors of Al Held reappear in this painting. Dutch museums, Eindhoven, Van Abbe Museum Eindhoven, Boijmans van Beuningen, Rotterdam, Stedelijk Museum Amsterdam. Dutch museums were incredibly important for Raoul De Keyser and many other Belgian artists in the early and mid-1960s. In the sense that Belgium in the 60s was much, and in the 50s and early 60s, was directed toward Paris and Francophone culture. But in the mid-60s, this shifted. A new generation of contemporary artists and younger artists, they moved their interests to the Anglo-Saxon world, and many of these major American artists, they had their big first shows in Europe, in Holland, or in Düsseldorf, for instance, and this was very important to De Keyser. Again, to these kinds of images. He displayed his paintings showing everyday elements in a kind of everyday environment here on the farm, very close to his house, where he had his first studio before he could rearrange his house and extend his house and create a studio in his house. But the funny thing, or the interesting thing, is that this image is based on this image, and often you can see like a kind of new configuration that originates from these kinds of contrasts, as if fragments of a single painting are combined with other fragments in a kind of new garden-like environment. So the new work in its turn is then, of course, installed in a garden, and we can go on and on like this. Also, like you could say many of his paintings, many of his flat two-dimensional paintings are placed in a garden-like environment as if they were a tent. The tent is a very important topic, a very important motif, as I have shown a few minutes ago. And De Keyser puts them, also his paintings, in like a kind of garden-like setting, as if they were tents. And also the slices, the three-dimensional vertical formats he experimented with in the late 60s, early 70s. And then, of course, he made these kinds of paintings in which his original work appear in a landscape-like environment. The same with his three-dimensional boxes, and that reappear in two-dimensional paintings. Something similar here, and even like the relation between the three paintings evokes like a kind of photographic operations, and so they evoke the different stages of a zoom lens, for instance, in a kind of relation that is similar to the relation between the three very first paintings here in the exhibition in one of the first slides I have shown. In the 80s and 90s, many photographs of paintings on walls, leaning against the wall, in which De Keyser experimented with different compositions, making mini exhibitions, as it were. Photographing a painting from different perspectives, clearly interested in the way the light reflects on the very uneven texture of this painting, this beautiful painting over from 1992. And also very, look here at this box here he used to as a kind of stand for this painting, and also in these photographs you can find in De Keyser Studios. Literally, that's the title you can find on the back. After the performance of Over, as if he made like a kind of, as the painting itself made like a kind of performance. Other studio views, you can see that he experiments with not only the combinations between paintings, but as if he corrects some of the paintings through a photograph, as if he created a new composition with the help of a photographic reproduction. And so first the photograph is cropped or retouched in order to transform the original painting itself, and I would like to finish my talk with some spectacular examples of this. Here you can see these two paintings placed in a landscape. So the painting Uit Formaat, which was destroyed later because only a small part of it was kept. It's something like this part was destroyed. And this painting, Wat naast een kleur gebeurt, what happens next to a color. And so this is a photograph also in the archives by Raoul De Keyser, which he retouched. He erased this painting completely apart from this little detail, and so this is the original detail, which was then of course overpainted in 85 from this 1986 painting. And of course another famous and very funny example I've written and published before, it's this painting, Bain de Jeun from 77, which was included in a group show, Raoul De Keyser, David Rabinovich, Philippe van Snick and Richard Tuttle in the Museum for Contemporary Art in Ghent in 78. And there was this black and white catalog, quite cheaply made, but the image was a bit wrongly reproduced. It was slightly tilted, and as a result of which there was like a kind of wedge shape, very small wedge-like shape created here on the left upper and right bottom corner. And so what De Keyser did, he made new paintings based on the wrong reproduction of his painting. And so he made it one version wedges, where you see these kinds of wedges painted on the bigger painting. And the other one is, of course, also one of the most beautiful paintings I think De Keyser made, also here on display upstairs, a clochard, which he also corrected, you could say, but here he disconnected the canvas from the stretcher, and he added these kinds of wedge-like shapes in various colors. And because of the disconnection, and this was like a kind of the painting became loose, you could say, and the edges became frayed, and the kind of shabby look was the result. And the painting now, the canvas now, looks like a clochard, and that's why he called it like that. So even De Keyser's most tactile works, you could say, that his focus, works in which he focuses on the materiality, on the texture, on the three-dimensional presence of the painting, and it's really important here, the depth of the frame. Even these works refer to photography, and so I think this is my last and convincing my last and hopefully convincing argument to show you that photography for Raoul De Keyser was indeed important. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for this really insightful lecture, and it gave me more than I've expected. Vielen Dank. Ich glaube, dass Sie haben das sehen können, wie Raoul De Keyser mit Bildern spielen kann, wie er in Bildern denkt und diese Bilder miteinander verbindet. Es gibt die Möglichkeit zu fragen.
Feel free to ask your question in German. I understand, or I can read, but
Es wurden ja viele Fragen.
I wouldn't rape the German language. So.
Es wurden ja viele Fragen auch beantwortet, die man vielleicht in der Ausstellung hatte. Ja, es waren ein paar Bilder zu sehen, ein paar Porträts von Raoul De Keyser selber, wo er fotografiert wurde, hinter dem Fußballnetz. Ja. And there is another portrait that was made in the very last year, showing him in his studio with all these bird cages. Yeah. And when I see how aware he was with all the photos, what do you think was his part in this I mean, I think it was a photographer who did it,
Yeah.
but
Well, it's difficult to have, I mean, to answer this because I think it relates really from case to case. I mean, I know of some portraits that he was asked to pose in certain positions and he was not really happy about this. So, and also the portrait with the bird cages is one of these portraits. So it really depends from case to case. I don't know, I don't think he was really specifically or had any specific attention for his kind of self-presentation as a kind of artist, although to a certain extent he was like this kind of elusive, this kind of, yeah, he was once called a kind of the Sphinx of Deinze, so the kind of Sphinx-like character of the little city where he worked and lived, but there was he had like a kind of aloofness, definitely, but I don't think it was important for his artistic career, this kind of self-presentation of him as an artist.
hat ja eben auch selber...
Maybe I can,
Yeah.
because he also, for instance, had a lot of interest for artists that were civil servants like himself. So he was completely, I think he was afraid to be represented as the stereotypical artist in a way. I think that was important to a certain extent. That he was an artist in a serious way, but at the same time he was something else again as well.
wollte nicht berechnet werden, das habe ich auch den Eindruck, also nicht berechenbar sein. Ja. Und deswegen hat er ja auch gesagt, wundert euch nicht, wenn ich morgen Kanarienvögel male, beispielsweise. Und aber ich glaube, das ist auch dieses Bewusstsein für das Bild, dass man die Fotos von ihm wiederum interpretiert, also dass man selber anfängt zu spielen mit den Bildern. Also als ich das Bild gesehen habe, das Porträt mit den vielen Käfigen, da denkt man natürlich sofort, dass eben dieser gefangene Raum, dass das für ihn kein enger Raum war, sondern eigentlich ein Raum, den man mit Fantasie weiten konnte.
And of course the grid-like structure there.
Also schauen Sie, das Foto ist auch ganz klein abgebildet im Katalog. Eigentlich ein surreales, ich sage einfach mal belgisches Foto, also eines belgischen Künstlers wo die Figur, die dargestellt ist, eigentlich relativ klein erscheint und dann aber 2/3 des Bildes von leeren Käfigen eingenommen wird oder mit kleinen Vögeln drin. Also wirklich ein sehr ungewöhnliches Porträt. So ungewöhnlich wie auch die Bilder. Jetzt gibt es eine Frage. Ja.
Isn't it striking that all the paintings with very direct reference to photography, like with the repetition, that they all are destroyed or disappeared?
Yes, that's indeed, yeah, that's really striking, yeah.
And how do you understand that?
As if, I don't know, maybe that was too literal for him. So indeed, the paintings with the negative strips, they're all destroyed, as far we know. Yeah, or I mean, of some we are sure that they are destroyed because he wrote it himself in his kind of listings of the works he made. But some of them are lost as well. Yeah, but it's really striking. Yeah.
When do you think he destroyed the paintings? Because also our first painting, or the first painting that he described as the first painting, is the number 4 in his Werkverzeichnis. But when did he destroy them?
Yeah, but it's also a mystery. When did he make that Werkverzeichnis? That's also not clear. So I'm sure he destroyed many them quite soon after they were made, but other ones only 20, 30 years later. And destruction, I mean, it's really destroyed. I mean, I know of some works, for instance, because I know his sons, or like Roland Joris, he told me I was there. He destroyed that painting when I was there in front of my eyes. But others, of course, were destroyed because they were cropped, or because they were overpainted, or because they were cut in half and things like that. So destruction in the case of De Keyser, it's very in various forms and various operations. And Also then in the catalog or in his listings, it's not really a detailed catalog, it's more like a kind of listing, I would say. Also in the Werkverzeichnis, it's very complicated because sometimes a work, for instance, number 55, it gets a new number, 602, but it's not always the case. So it's really, there are different kinds of destruction used by De Keyser. Yeah.
So he refuses orders, regulars and systems. Weitere Fragen? Viele Antworten gibt es auch tatsächlich im Katalog und in dem wunderbaren Artikel, in dem Essay, den Steven Jacobs geschrieben hat, auch mit vielen Vergleichsabbildungen, nochmal andere, als die jetzt hier auch gezeigt wurden. Ich glaube, es ist wirklich ein großer Schatz, der da gehoben wurde. Und vielleicht das als letzte Frage, wie lange hat das gedauert und wie viele Generationen von Studenten oder wann ist das übergeben worden? Und war das immer dieselben Studenten, die daran jetzt gearbeitet haben?
Well, it depends. I mean, the archives, so the personal archives donated by De Keyser are donated to the Gent University Library. But that doesn't include artwork, so it's personal papers, photography, documentation, books, clippings from press and things like that. Actually, we're still working on it, so every year I have a few students working on it. But then the research on the photography project, I did this myself. And so we started quite soon working on the archives in 2012, 2013, so.
Right after the death of the artist,
right after he died, yeah.
Aber es ist eben erstaunlich, dass man das alles überhaupt nicht gekannt hat oder die Familie wusste es wahrscheinlich, aber es hat niemand gesichtet und so zieht sich auch durch die ganzen Bücher, auch durch das eigene Schreiben hindurch, dass Raoul De Keyser mit solchen Vorbildern nichts zu tun hatte und das ist jetzt wirklich der Beweis. Und wir hatten auch in der ersten Presseinformation stand auch noch drin, er hatte überhaupt keine fotografischen Vorbilder, überhaupt keine, er hat sich nie, das ist alles durch das direkte Sehen entstanden und das ist wirklich jetzt eine Erkenntnis dieser Ausstellung. Thank you for this lecture, for this evening und danke an alle, die gekommen sind und einen schönen Abend weiterhin.
Thank you.
Danke sehr.